Cuban expat. Yes, expatriate. So yes. So it's like I would almost call it refugee.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually the term that we use the most,
Right.
refugee or political exiles.
Yeah, a political exile. That's the best way. That's the best way to help you understand. So Mailyn is a Cuban political exile, and my good friend, and an entrepreneur, a successful businesswoman. She's everything all wrapped up into one big package, and really sad because she can't be in her home country. And how do we all feel about Colorado, right? That's the way she feels about Cuba. And so I think it's important that as you're getting these news reports and people are talking about Cuba in different ways, it's what do we talk about in History Day? Primary sources are the thing. Dude, you have a primary source about what's going on in Cuba. So I'm going to turn it over to Mailyn and let you tell the story of Cuba. So,
Well, thank you so
yeah.
much, Celeste, for the invitation. Thank you all for having me here and being willing to put up with my Cuban issues venting session here today. Hopefully, the goal is that everybody walks out with their eyes open to a new reality that probably not many have been heard or been exposed to before. So I want to ask, and I start asking like really quick, how many of you know what the nuts and bolts with Cuba is, and how many of you have heard about it in the last 2 weeks on the news? Okay, some of you. Good. Just to kind of like give you the primer of it, I was born and raised in communist Cuba. I left in 2001 at age 27. As soon as I finished my law school, I went to the University of Havana and I graduated with a Juris Doctor from the law school there. Left the country shortly after. Never practiced law in Cuba because in order to do that, I would have to have registered with what is the equivalent of the board here in the United States for attorneys, and the minute that I would do that, I would be on the government database as like important or like really, significant professionals, and they would have never allowed me to leave. For those of you that have some background information about Cuba, in 1959, Fidel Castro took over. He led a guerrilla with the so-called revolution and took over the control of the country. In the first 2 or 3 years, he sold himself as Democrat, democracy type of president, someone that supposedly was going to fix all the mistakes and all the problems that the island had with the previous government. That was a ruthless dictatorship as well. Turned out that at the end, he basically lied to everybody with his promises of hope and change, and ended up establishing another dictatorship on the island that had been in power for 62 years. The only difference that in this case is actually a communist regime. So it's a totalitarian, centralized, completely controlled of every single aspect of your life in the hands of a communist government led by the Communist Party and obviously by 7 different types of military elites. So that's the Cuba that I was born and grew up until I left in 2001. I lived for a few years in Miami, went to Florida International University and completed a master's in mass communication and journalism in there, and that's how I ended up moving to Colorado because I got a job offer right after I graduated, and that's how I moved to Greeley back in 2004. I have been here since then. Colorado is now home. My kids were born here. When I became an American citizen, I was able to get my parents out of Cuba. I brought them straight here. So, almost 15 years in Colorado make you feel that this is the place that we call home now. However, you still have the homeland and the place where you were born. I still have family there. I mean, granted, not that close because I'm a single child, but I still have second, third cousins, aunts, classmates, people that work with me, my neighbors that we all, live in the same neighborhood for 20 something years. So it's still a very strong attachment to the point that even my best friend, that best friend that you kind of like, meet in middle high school and that carry on with you until you graduate and all that, she's still Cuban. So my ties and my relationships there are still, very close and very real. With everything that has happened in the past 2 weeks, basically, for those of you that raise your hand and are kind of like aware, is that something like want average, regular Cuban people to come to the streets to march. There was like a island-wide uprising to march and protest, asking for freedom, asking for the Communist Party to quit and leave the island, asking for free and multi-party elections, asking for the release of all the political prisoners, asking literally for a real change in the island. And this was something unprecedented because when you live in a totalitarian society like in Cuba, you have several things factoring against you as an individual to be able to express yourself unless you want to, kowtow the line approved by the government and the Communist Party. So you were born and raised in government-controlled public schools that are basically indoctrination mills. You have all the repression. You have like 7 different types of repressive military and police forces. You have the CDRs, which are like committees of snitches in the neighborhood that will rat you out if you say or do something against the government. And just imagine living in this closed society, and then all of a sudden, we have on a Sunday somebody posts on a Facebook group, oh, and by the way, now they have access to social media, and people have iPhones because obviously we, the expats that live abroad, that still have family there, we still help. Many people now have access to phones, and even though the internet connection is censored, controlled, and overregulated by the government, and they price it in a way that is basically unaffordable for any other citizen on the island, still people try to use it. And it was through a connect on a Facebook group on a small town that is called San Antonio de los Baños, which is south of the capital, where all this started. Because imagine a society where the economy is just an utter failure because socialist, centrally cramped economy doesn't work at all. And these countries have been literally in ruins, not only psychologically and philosophical speaking in the sense of freedom and rights, but also like materially speaking in ruins with buildings crumbling down, no public transportation, on rationing books for food since the 1970s. So it's a really, really critical, basically living like a destitute person. That's the life for the average Cuban. And then these people got together and they say, we're going to go out and we're going to protest in front of what would be the equivalent of the city hall of the town. And that's how everything started. And then in a matter of hours on Sunday, July 11, we had reports of more than 50 protests that happened organically, just spontaneously, in 50 different locations in the island. So that's all that happened on Sunday. And obviously we start getting those reports through social media. Many people, like myself included, all over the United States, all over the world, we assign ourselves the task of receiving videos, receiving pictures, receiving testimonies, and translating them into the target language of the country where we are. So people, regular people, my fellow Americans, can actually understand what was going on, what were their demands, what they were protesting and taking the streets for, which is a huge contrast with what you can hear in the media or even from elected officials and government official channels, what they put out in the media. So basically, that's kind of like what has happened in these past weeks. Even though many of us have been involved with activism for the cause of freedom for Cuba for many, many years, what happened on July 11 was again a turning point because never in the island something this big had happened before. Never in so many locations at the same time. Never so many people. I was still in Cuba when there were protests in 1994 before the tractor crisis during the Clinton administration. I'm not sure, you guys were probably kids or not even born when that happened. Yes, there were things that happened, and there were people who tried to fight the regime, but again, there was no internet, there was no social media. I knew about it because the one that happened in Havana happened right there next to the university where I was, so I was able to witness it and see it. But now, just fast forward time to the 21st century, and then we have the youngest generation of millennials and the oldest Gen Zs, which are the children that were born in Cuba after the Berlin Wall and the entire communist bloc in Eastern Europe disappeared. So those kids were born like in utter misery. They were not like, during my childhood, Cuba was a satellite from the Soviet Union, so there were still like a pipeline of things getting into the island to the point that you would still get, I don't know, toothpaste or condensed milk or things like that shipped directly from Russia. These teenagers, these young Cubans that are taking the streets now, they were born after that. They were born with this special period where Castro didn't have any other choice than opening the country to the foreign tourism because, you know, it was going to be literally like a mass starvation. And it's been super, super interesting to hear when I am talking about listening to those testimonies or receiving the videos, seeing what people are saying on camera for the rest of the world to know what's going on. It has been like a both impressive and crushing at the same time to hear Cubans as young as 16, 17 saying, I was born in a country and in a situation and in a society that was completely hopeless. I really got nothing to lose. If I have to be the first one they're going to shot in the middle of the street, so be it. And then listening to things like that has mobilized a lot of not only Cubans exiles in the United States, but all over the world, but many of our fellow Americans that are, you know, they have solidarity and they have identified with the cause of freedom in Cuba. They have identified with the danger that it represents for any country or any society in the world to allow the government to grow too big, to be too centrally planned regarding economic aspects of our life, because at the end, that equation always ends up with the government power and government force crushing our individuals' rights and freedoms. So that's all that has happened in these 2 weeks. We have taken up to the task to actually dispel the media misinformation, like I mentioned before, not only from the mainstream media, but from many officials and elected officers in this country, in all states, where they actually have been trying to keep carrying the water with the message that the Communist Party and the government in Cuba have, when the reality of what people are asking in the streets is completely different. For those of you that were able to take a look at some of the videos or the interviews that Celeste shared, at first, during the first 72 hours, they tried to sell it like people were protesting because they wanted COVID-19 vaccines. I mean, granted, when you have a society in this state that I've described to you, you put a pandemic on it, on an island that by, you know, the law of geography and nature is a prison itself because there's no, you know, land borders to go anywhere. Obviously, it's going to be like the proverbial cherry on the top for a situation that is already bad, but that was not the reason why so many young Cubans took on the streets. They were beat up to death in the streets by the special forces of the police. They were shot in the back. They were dragged out of their houses in the middle of the night because you know what the technique of the political police is? They go and they physically remove your phone from your hands, okay? There's not such a thing as a warrant or, you know, my private property in Cuba or anything like that. They would take people's smartphones and they would open to look for photos and videos to identify people faces, and that's how they would go to that person's house and drag them in the middle of the night and get them in jail. And there's some that are still, up to last night, I checked, the last number was like 752 that are reported either missing or already in prison. And then just a week after the protest started, they started these summary trials, type of like kangaroo trials, where all these protesters were summary trials in a matter of hours without defense attorney, without being able to read the dockets with the cases against them, without being able to even notify your family. And from these 757, I think it was the number that I read last night, 32 of them are minors. 32 of them are younger than 17. We are doing like a movement to compile online and on social media, both reports of people missing or in prison, and also reports of people that have suffered abuse and torture while being arrested. both by the Army Special Forces Police and the regular police. And the most crushing, heartbreaking testimonies are from those minors that have been in prison because they were protesting in the streets, asking for freedom. They were not asking for COVID vaccines. They were not asking for more remittances like the current administration wants to send to Cuba. They were not asking for more personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. They were not asking for more like a softening of the immigration policies for people who travel to Cuba to be able to bring, I don't know, a bigger suitcase with more medications or shoes or that's not what they were asking for. Actually, the biggest majority of the people who took the streets in Cuba are the ones in the lowest scale, whatever standard of living you might have there. Most of the people that took the streets in Cuba do not have a family living abroad that can send them any remittances, that can send them any bad clothes or medicine or anything like that. So that was never the point. And I mean, it's plainly wrong and immoral to have any media, any government, anybody with any audience whatsoever, I don't care if it's in the standard media or a new influencer, to twist the message of something that is a humanitarian crisis that is happening just 9 miles of Florida, which is the United States territory. So that's kind of like the overall situation of what it is. Granted, the Cuban government immediately took the army out, the special forces. They received special forces both from Mexico, Venezuela, and now from China to train and help beat up people on the streets. In Cuba, there is a mandatory draft for boys before they go into college. I mean, it doesn't matter what career you choose to go in the university. Before you go there, you have to serve in the military. And they're kept like in some sort of like reserve brigades. Those kids were being dragged out of their houses in the middle of the night, they were gotten into trucks, they were given military boots, they were given baseball bats, tonfas, sticks, whatever, and then they would be transported in those trucks to a different town, not theirs, and they would be told to go in the streets and beat up the protesters in a different neighborhood where they were. And this is just kind of like, you know, little flashes, snippets here and there of the reality that we have been trying to, again, translate, amplify, and share that we're receiving directly from Cuba. Probably nobody knows about it because it wasn't on the news, but last weekend there were close to 75,000 Cuban Americans from the entire United States that marched into D.C. It was called the Cuban Freedom Caravan that started in Florida. I don't know if any of you heard about it or have seen it on social media. For sure, it was not in any regular, you know, TV station, news, or anything like that. And they were there for the entire weekend. They did like a candlelight vigil for the people that have been in prison, for the people that have been abused and tortured, for the ones that have been killed. And they brought a proposal to the White House. Obviously, they were never given an audience. But it was a big, big movement. And then that was only in D.C. It happened all over the world. If you guys have social media and you go and look the hashtags SOS Cuba and Patria y Vida, you're gonna find that those protests were massive. They were actually support rallies all over the world, Latin America, in Europe, in Alaska. I saw one too in Japan, everywhere. Because for 62 years, the concept of the diaspora, of the Cuban exile outside Cuba has been like, we're not going to forget about you. We are here to support you, but you need to do your part. And if you're on the island, doing your part is being a peaceful protester. You know, it's exercising your First Amendment rights. And they did. Finally, they did. And we felt, the ones that are out of Cuba, that it was our time, you know, to hold our end of the bargain regarding supporting them. And that was kind of like the whole idea, you know, behind all these support rallies that we did. I don't know if you have been around the Capitol too, because we have Saturday the 17th, there was a big rally there. Granted, there are not many Cubans Americans in Colorado, but the ones that live here, we feel that it was also our duty to do it. And even from the distance, to let know those loved ones that were left behind that we are rooting for them. That we might have had our hands tied, no, but we are supporting your cause. genocide. On Monday, when the unelected president of Cuba went on to live TV, and he basically said that the streets were for the revolutionaries and they were ready to kill whoever was not agreeing with them, that was a call to civil war on live TV. That guy that nobody voted for, that it was just appointed by the Castros because they handled the island like a slave plantation, literally, and they pass it down to each other like it is, the big house in the hills that people inherit when the oldest owner died. That guy called for a civil war on live TV, and I think that was also a big eye-opening call for everybody, for the public opinion in other countries and all that. And that's the battle that we have been doing since then. Number one, trying to get a coalition, not only to get an actual leadership response from the United States government, but also to get the same response and the same coalition from other governments in other countries around the world. Because beyond any, foreign policy caveats that might be here, it's an issue of human rights. It's an issue of racial justice. It's an issue of doing the right thing for people that are basically under a genocide promoted by their own government. And that's what I am right now. That has been like my doing God's work in a sense all these weeks, just having these interviews, having these exchanges, just to let people know what's really going on. And the whole point that we always have is that by sharing our testimonies and our experiences and the information that we're receiving directly from the island, we can open the eyes of at least one person. It will be totally worth it, absolutely worth it. And I think it's very important, especially for younger Americans, because again, I cannot reiterate that enough. It is impressive that it's been the younger generations of Cubans, the ones that have said, I'm fed up, I'm done with this is not right. I have been systemically oppressed and repressed in every sense and possible shape and form by this government, and I got nothing else to lose. And I think that was impressive. And with that being said, I'm just going to open it up to your questions.
Wait, can we explain, sorry, I just wanted to explain one thing. So when because I know this because you said it to me in 2016, when the country, so explain how we couldn't travel, and then we could, and that wasn't a good thing.
Oh, so it's basically, how many of you have ever heard about the embargo, the Cuban embargo? Okay. Does anybody know why or how the embargo was imposed on Cuba? Which, by the way, is an embargo, it's not a blockade. There is quite a big difference between them two. Anybody knows? No. Okay. When Castro took over in 1959, he expropriated and confiscated individual private property, both commercial and personal residential, that belonged to American citizens. And that was the whole reason why the Holmes-Burton Act was passed by the US Congress. So no, it's not illegal. It was voted in Congress by American legislators because it was a response based on one of the few jobs the government should have, which is protecting the individual property rights of American citizens. The Cuban government never paid for those properties like they were supposed to be according to international conventions when a government, expropriates or takes over somebody else's property, and that's how the legislation was born. But then over 60 years, all the restrictions and all that have been watered down by different administrations, by different modifications in Congress and all that, to the point that up to 2009, probably the only few regulations is like American companies and banks, they can trade with Cuba on certain things, but Cuba has to pay cash. They cannot be extended credit by any bank or American financial institution. There was limitations on the travel of American citizens to Cuba. Why? Because in Cuba everything is owned by the government and the military, actually. The army generals and the military elites, they are the ones that control these shell companies that are like managing the tourism with the hotels, managing the litter industry that they have. It's all between that elite. And that was one of the reasons, because then by doing that, you're obviously putting money on the government pockets. There's no other way around. That's exactly what you're doing. Along these lines, many people have been trying to say that what's happening in Cuba is the fault of the embargo. And once again, the testimonies that we're getting from Cubans on the island, not for anybody that wants to be Cuba explaining you here what is happening there and they have never set foot there, okay? It's a whole different story. From people on the island, it's not what they're asking for. Yes, the Cuban government has used embargo as an excuse for everything from a hurricane to mosquitoes to whatever. Yes, it's true. But what is happening, the disaster in Cuba for 62 years have been based on the utter failure of a socialist economy, a socialist political system where the economy has been centrally planned. And yes, at some point they did run out of somebody else's money. And that's why the country is in the state that is right now. Then along these things that have been happening in the past weeks, as I was mentioning before, many people have been trying to keep pushing that storyline that is, this, it's embargo's fault when in reality it's not. Because if you look at trade and commerce statistics, actually from both countries, the United States and Cuba, and everything that's available online, you can see that the United States is like everything that Cuba gets from the United States is like in the top 5 industry trades. We're talking about billions of dollars that Cuba gets from the United States in the form of food, medications, medical equipment, seeds, agricultural equipment, agricultural supplies, and on top of that, they don't have any restriction with the rest of the countries of the world. We're talking about what, 190 something? Don't quote me on the number, but there are other countries in the world that they freely trade with. So that obviously is not the case, or is not the reason for this uprising, more so when we have people on camera and video telling you, this is not to lift the embargo. I don't need vaccines. I don't want another bag, or I don't want more remittances. I want freedom. I want free elections. I want the political prisoners to be released, and I want the Communist Party to go away. That's basically what they've been claiming since the uprising started. So, does that answer your question? Okay.
So what are your thoughts currently now that you are an adult? What are your, since you grew up in such an oppressive place, what are your thoughts on more liberal to socialist to communist viewpoints?
They're evil. They're evil. Anything that crushes individual rights is evil. And you're going to have different degrees on it, and you're going to have movement in societies that are going to try to repackage and rebrand it with new fancy names. At the end of the day, government is force. The bigger you have the government, the more force you're going to have against the individual. And that is always a losing game for the one person that is actually, the smallest minority in the entire world, which is the individual at its rights. And then that's when we talk about political and society dynamics. In the economic form, it's right there in pictures everywhere. The country is destroyed. And then you don't have that. Has anybody read Animal Farm? So then that's the story of Cuba and any other socialist country in the world. They sell you this story of equality, and then at the end, only the 1% of the elite are the ones that are living a good life. Everybody else is equally poor. And then that's why you're going to find probably very often when you're talking with anybody, not only Cubans, Americans, but anybody that is an expat or refugee from a socialist country, that we always use that line that, well, yeah, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, because only those in those elites that are controlling the life of the rest of the population are the ones that live like we do here in our first world bubbles type of life. So yeah, for me, anything that means collectivization, anything that means centralized power or giving more power to the government is just immoral and it's